about storytelling and specifically ethical storytelling. And just to get us started, I wanted to share a little bit of my background. So my journey in the anti-trafficking space started when I was a student at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, California. And it was actually during this time that I also met Sandy Morgan. And so during my time at Fuller, I was introduced to what human trafficking is and was. And my focus was on working with children at risk. And so I had the flexibility and ability to really pour myself into researching specifically child trafficking and exploitation. And that research through Fuller took me throughout Los Angeles and then eventually overseas, where I did my thesis work in India and South Africa. And during that time, my stereotypes, I think like many of us, were challenged, my questions were changed, and overall the deep exposure to the complexities of human trafficking left me with more questions than answers. And when I returned to LA, quite honestly, I was exhausted, I was brokenhearted, but I did come back with two things that I didn't know before I left. The first of that is that poverty is more often than not at the root of trafficking. And second, that there was a huge service gap in the area of prevention. And while many organizations were focusing on rescue and aftercare for survivors, there were very few, or even sometimes none at all, that had the bandwidth to focus on prevention as well. And so the idea of prevention really intrigued me. And so it was no surprise that a few months later, through a series of events, I met a group of national leaders working in northern Thailand who were also interested in starting a prevention program. And so we combined forces and started what is today known as the Freedom Story. It's a trafficking prevention organization that's entirely led by Thai national leadership. You might actually notice that I have Thai subtitles right now as I'm speaking, and I do apologize. This is from when we had our staff meeting a couple weeks back, and I cannot for the life of me figure out how to turn them off. So apologies for that. But I've had the supreme joy of partnering with, learning with, and supporting the Freedom Story for the last 13 years. And in this role, I've often found myself in the role of a bridge between our US or Western donors and our staff and students in Thailand, spanning language barriers, cultural misunderstandings, navigating stereotypes, and at all of this, at the heart of it is story. And so, what is story? What is storytelling? Storytelling works for effective communication. You're in this webinar right now because you're interested in storytelling. We've grown up listening to stories, reading stories, making up stories, being impacted by the stories that we hear. Stories activate our imagination and engage our emotions. They literally light up more of the brain than a long list of bullet points will on a PowerPoint. In the book, The Storytelling Animal, the author, Jonathan Gottschall, argues that stories are what make us human. He asks, what is a human being? What most sets us apart? Our sapien says it's our human brain that sets us apart. But others say we're actually not that logical. It's our language and our thumbs and our sophistication. But what's left off of this list is that human beings live inside stories and that we as people are storytelling animals. We live in stories all day. We literally cannot help ourselves. We turn things into a story. We can all look at the same thing and see a different story, hear a different story, or feel a different story. We do this effortlessly. It's part of who we are as humans. We're trying to impose the order of story structure on the chaos of existence. An average person through TV is getting more than 4 hours of television per day. Congratulations if you are not that person. News stories, sports stories, love stories, murder stories, interactive stories of video games. Human beings live inside a storm of stories. We live in them all day long. We dream in them all night long. It's how we communicate, it's how we connect, how we learn, and how we think. But why? Why is the source, or what is the source of this power? We know that storytelling changes the brain, but how? All of the advice you read on putting together speeches and writing books and engaging with an audience says, tell a story. Don't share the facts. But I think what's missed in those statements is that there is still story in the data and story in the facts. The question is, are we looking for that story? Paul J. Zak, that's Z-A-K, is a scientist, author, and public speaker. He's authored the books The Moral Molecule and Trust Factor, and his lab discovered that a neurochemical called oxytocin, otherwise known as the love chemical, is a key it's safe to approach others signal that actually happens in our brain. So oxytocin is produced when we're trusted or shown a kindness, and it motivates cooperation with others. It does this by enhancing this sense of empathy, our ability to experience another person's emotion. Empathy is important for social creatures because it allows us to understand how others are likely to react in a situation, including those with whom we work. And so when we share stories, we are literally feeling the feelings of others, and there's an exchange of feelings or emotion or empathy. And as I was reflecting on my own journey in the context of cross-cultural literacy, this is what it kept coming back to for me: story. Story generates empathy, which gives you the ability to open yourself up to others' perspectives, to understand what's important to them, what motivates them, what their value system is. And this is where change happens. It's where needs are met and where beauty and relationship and trust are born. And even in the telling of story and the connection that happens through story, we are all still interpreting or remembering story in our own ways. And because of this, it's absolutely crucial that we understand the lens in which we see through. What lens are you looking through? This could be your socioeconomic status, your race, your gender, your age, your religion, your weight. What tags have you associated to yourself? Are you single? Are you married? Are you divorced? Do you have kids? For me, I was raised in an upper middle class family. I never had a lot of debt. My parents still love each other. My brother and I were often involved in their entrepreneurial endeavors and probably given way too much responsibility at much too young of an age. My parents also had a passion for the environment that led them to found one of the first ever Christian environmental organizations. And back in the 80s, the words Christian and environmental fit together like oil and water. They didn't. Thankfully, I was too young to know any of these social norms. And instead, I grew up with a gratitude for the world that I lived in and an education on how to care for it. My parents would often host family meetings where we would sit around the table with our feet barely touching the floor while they'd lay out their new ideas and ask us for our thoughts. Now, looking back, I of course realized that this was mostly them being cute. They already knew exactly what they were going to do, but the gesture of including us nonetheless gave us ownership and an awareness that went beyond just watching them. We all have early development stories that shape our lenses. Some are harder, some are more difficult, but we can't help what they are. And as we go up, we have moments outside of our immediate family that change or inform those lenses. My childhood best friend was Mormon. At the very wise age of 7, we'd have conversations about our different faiths. This taught me that what my parents told me was truth was not the only belief in the world. And I learned the importance and beauty of respecting someone I loved and our pluralistic views on spirituality. I lived internationally in a small village where no one spoke my language, which taught me to depend on the kindness of people and humbly realized that even a master's degree was not going to ensure that I leave the market with the groceries I needed for dinner. I went through a divorce in my late 20s, and I learned the devastating impact that mental illness can have on those you love. All of these experiences have informed the way in which I see the world and added layers to my ability to more deeply understand the feelings of others who have gone through similar experiences. And once we realize that we see through a lens, we can understand that everyone sees through a lens. If I learned nothing from my years working cross-culturally, it is that there is always more than one side and more than one lens. The globalized world that we're living in today offers a multitude of perspectives and lenses. Whereas traditionally we'd consider culture shock to be the obvious of a different country or language or food or way of living, I believe that we are dealing with culture shock all around us every single day, right here at home. Our world is much more interconnected than ever before. We can video chat with our friends in Europe for free through Zoom, stay in touch with those we haven't seen in years through Facebook, find just about anything we need to know from who the sixth US president was to how to make sourdough bread through a Google search on our phones. Within 24 hours, I can, or used to be able to, fly from San Francisco to Thailand, which would shift me rapidly from one cultural context to the next. Never before has it been possible to browse, examine, or engage with so many different points of view. We're able to transport ourselves between cultures and contexts faster and easier than ever before. There are thousands of ways of seeing the world and interpreting our experiences in it. And in the midst of our interconnection, we're realizing how different we can be from others. So fighting injustice in such a globalized world is not simply like building a chair from IKEA. This injustice can be overwhelmingly complicated because much like raising a child, there is no guidebook for humanity. Another way that we tend to deal with culture shock is by looking for simple explanations from small things, like categorizing others based on the clothing that they're wearing or the things that they say or the way that they say them, to larger things like how we choose to understand global poverty. We do this all the time and not just with each other. We have a tendency to reduce complex things, processes, and people in order to categorize them and move on with our lives. And our brains are actually doing this for us. So each one of us has what's called a prototypicality for most of the things that we encounter. Take, for example, the word dinosaur. What image comes to mind? I'm sure that in this room or those that are listening after, there's dozens, if not hundreds, of mental images that are populating in your brain. Whenever you hear or read the word dinosaur, your brain produces a mental image of a stegosaurus or a triceratops or a pterodactyl. For me, I think of The Land Before Time and I see Ducky and hear his little voice saying, yep, 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 which is one of my all-time favorite movies. Whatever image your brain produces when you hear the word dinosaur, that's your mental image or your prototypicality for it. It's not only with dinosaurs or birds or animals that we do this, but with more complex issues of justice as well. What's your mental image for global poverty, for abuse, for racism, or for human trafficking? When it comes to most things that we encounter in our daily lives, not only do we have simplistic images for them, we also have subconscious mental boxes that are labeled good or bad or safe or dangerous, acceptable or wrong, that we file them into. Like justice is good or injustice is bad. Traffickers are dangerous and NGO workers are the heroes. We use these boxes to sift through all of the things that we come across on a daily basis. We have the tendency to reduce beautifully variegated people and beliefs to dehumanizing cliches. And unfortunately, the anti-trafficking movement as a whole is no exception to this. It's impossible to know it all. Every perspective, every motivation, every lens, we all have a particular lens based on our culture, our social setting, our economic location, etc. Through interacting with others' perspectives, we realize that our lens on reality is not the only lens of reality. That while others' perspectives are not ours, we may never be able to understand them completely. This doesn't mean that our perspectives are wrong, nor that they can't still add tremendous value. And so while boxes and stereotypes or labels can be limiting, the fact that we use them is not bad in and of itself. Categorizing our experiences in simplistic ways allows us to navigate a complex, rapidly changing and confusing world without losing our minds. The danger, of course, is that if we only surround ourselves with people or books or ideas that we agree with, and therefore reinforce the way that we see the world, we start to believe that our way of seeing the world is the way of seeing the world. And we close ourselves off to learning new things and growing as individuals. As a recent expert on human trafficking in Thailand shared, good intentions are not always beneficial if they lack clarity and understanding. It may be in our enthusiasm to push for policies and programs and legal mechanisms that we actually neglect the voices of the people themselves. The help we wish to offer may become a hindrance. And the idea of listening to the people that we're trying to help before we try and help them might seem obvious to you. But if you know anything about the history of development, relief, humanitarian aid, prevention, or NGO, anything in general, then you know how novel this idea actually is. We in the NGO world are starting to learn from our mistakes, thankfully, and placing more of our efforts towards investing in local leadership so that solutions and innovation come from the people who know what is needed best. Our words matter. We can't talk about storytelling without talking about words. Stories are often made up of words, and these words matter. They could be spoken words, written words, words in a song. You get the idea. But more often than not, the way that we tell stories today involves words and language. Words have the ability to calm, to anger, to trigger, to show love, affection, or even hate and misunderstanding. Think of the people in your life who have shaped you. Did they offer their own stories of growth and lessons learned? What questions did they ask you that helped you to feel known and safe, or even challenged when you needed it? The words we choose for one another and the stories that we tell with those words are a direct reflection of our empathy and understanding for others. Oftentimes, the constituents that we work with find themselves in crisis mode. According to Harvard University economics professor, I'm going to not know how to say his name, Senhil Mullainathan, in his book, Scarcity, Why Having Too Little Means So Much, he says that scarcity forms a common chord across so many of society's problems. The book weaves three main points. So spoilers ahead, and I do recommend reading it. It's an excellent read. The first has to do with scarcity and bandwidth. Bandwidth basically means how much of our mental capacity is available to us at a given time. All sorts of distractions can eat up our bandwidth. You and I might have similar IQs or years of experience, but if you're only getting 3 hours of sleep, have fault on your mortgage, taking care of your elderly mom, you're likely to do a much poorer job than I am on a variety of cognitive tasks. Now, the second looks at how scarcity, the sense of having more needs and resources to satisfy them, can play out in the real world, particularly in regards to the poor. I appreciate his perspective that the arguments about the poor having inferior personal or work habits or morals misses the point. Rather, the strains on bandwidth that they face offer a more persuasive explanation for why poverty so often begets poverty. If you're a single mom living under the poverty line, for example, you may fail to accomplish routine tasks such as renewing food stamps or scheduling a child's checkup appointment, not because you're lazy, but because your brain is overloaded by worry and stress. And finally, the book suggests that a new understanding of the dynamics of scarcity could change the way we view and do things. One of the important public policy lessons I gleaned from the book is that tweaks, not massive changes, can accomplish a ton. For example, he cites the example of job training programs geared towards the poor that are often painfully underattended, leading some to argue that these workers don't want to be better themselves. The solution, understanding that as low-income people, they're juggling a variety of different obligations. Rather than building programs in a way that if an attendee misses one class, they'll immediately fall behind, why not anticipate the challenges and build them into the program structure, providing some flexibility for clientele who require it? So how are we developing systems for people that may be experiencing scarcity and lack of bandwidth? The words we use, the programs we build, and the stories that we tell has to take into account the narrative that is the reality. So how do we become truth tellers? When I first started ethical storytelling for the Freedom Story, my focus was on, let me start that over. When I first started storytelling, not ethical storytelling, for the Freedom Story, my focus was on the donor. I wanted to create emotionally driven content to motivate people to give. And unfortunately, this meant creating what we call today pity content that generated pity from a donor to want to give to those we served. This meant oftentimes putting the dignity of the constituent or the person whose story we were sharing second to the importance of a donor. The Freedom Story actually started as the Soul Project, and we were born out of a documentary. And our original documentary featured a young girl named Kat. Kat was 9 years old when we produced her short film, which included personal details of her family and highlighted her vulnerabilities. In 2009, we toured with the film to 25 different cities across America, entering it into film festivals, screening it at community centers, and raising awareness about the hope of trafficking prevention. It was a beautiful film, and donors responded. People were hearing our message and offering to help, but we hadn't taken into account what Kat wanted the film to be and how she wanted her story told. We, quite bluntly, had inserted our agenda above hers. When Kat turned 18, we were legally allowed to put the film online, and I asked if that would be something that she wanted. She said no, and that began a conversation about why. Over the course of the last few years, we've been developing what we call ethical storytelling, which, in layman terms, means moving away from pity-based marketing and towards a more human-centered approach to storytelling. And as I sifted through what we've learned about ethical storytelling, these points emerged to share with you today. So first, recognizing the typical story arc. What I mean when I say this is that most nonprofit narratives will follow a very typical story arc, and it goes like this. Person X is hurting. So let's say I'll put myself in this situation. Rachel is hurting. Rachel has this problem. And then Rachel meets an organization. So that person meets this organization, and now that person is fixed. This is a typical narrative and story arc that we see so often, and probably many of us, including myself, have used. Now, thinking through that story arc, we can begin to poke and prod it, and you'll begin to uncover so many issues and concerns. One is, of course, the heroizing of the nonprofit. Second, of course, is that at the end, we show that that person is fixed. We don't take into account that journeys continue, lives continue. Third, where is the person, the constituent, in the process of telling their own story? And so as we begin to wrestle with kind of this typical story arc that we see in the nonprofit space, I would invite us to flip that. How can we begin to tell stories that, rather than heroizing the nonprofit, heroize and center the person whose story is being told, to prioritize their voice and tell the story in the way that they would want it to be told, to share narratives that connect us in our humanity, and to connect us in our empathy rather than provoking pity. Second is deep consent versus consent. We talk a lot about consent in the nonprofit space. Did someone sign the consent form? Do we have someone's permission? Deep consent takes this a step further. Deep consent involves the consent of the storyteller as well as those close to them. It means talking through how a story will be used and where it will be used, highlighting the potential pros and cons throughout. It means creating a sunset policy, a mutually agreed upon date of expiration for the story. Not all stories need to stay online for the entirety of the nonprofit's existence, and sometimes this can actually even be harmful. Third is considering the impact. Who will be impacted? What are the various audiences that would be impacted when a story is shared? A lot of times there's three audiences that come to mind. The storyteller, or the person that's sharing their story, the audience, those who will be reading or seeing the story, and the larger community, in this case, the anti-trafficking movement as a whole. There may be more audiences depending on whose story you're sharing and where, but to start, keep these three in mind. How will sharing this story impact the storyteller? Does it highlight their strengths and inspire them? Or does it further perpetuate a harmful stereotype? Does sharing this story put them in any danger? Does it bring shame to them or their families? Or, hopefully, does sharing this story shine a mirror of resilience and strength and overcoming? And what about the audience? In this case, most likely it's donors or potential donors. Does this story generate pity? Or does it connect us together in our humanity? And what about the movement as a whole? Does the story accurately reflect the truth of the anti-trafficking movement, or does it sensationalize? And the last point for today is utilizing people first language. People first language aims to avoid perceived and subconscious dehumanization when discussing people with disabilities, when discussing survivors, when discussing the poor, et cetera, et cetera. Translated to ethical storytelling, people first language aims to avoid perpetuating stereotypes and stigmas when we're talking about people. For example, is it an at-risk child or a child at risk? By putting the word child first, you're humanizing the adjective rather than having the adjective be the primary focus before their humanity. So to close, the words and the lens that we tell our stories through, whether these are stories for policy change, for healthcare reform, for NGO fundraising, or in the anti-trafficking movement, these stories and these words shape our humanity. As I mentioned earlier, Kat, the young woman whose documentary inspired so many of us to believe in the power of trafficking prevention, rather than sharing with you her original film, I actually wanted to share a short 3-minute interview that highlights her reflections on the way her story was originally told. So I'm gonna go ahead and play that for you now, and then we can open it up to some questions. What do you think your mom would think of where you are today?
I think she will proud with me. My name is Kat. I am a when I have a scholarship, my mind is changed. I can think in the future. I can think more than that. What I want to be, what I want to do, what I want to study. I can think in that way. But before, no, just can read and can write. I think it's better and help my life a lot. Have me more experience and make me understand many things better.
You watch the film now. How does it make you feel?
The first thing I miss my mom is make me think I am grown up and my life is very different than the film. Right now, my life is better, a lot better than in that film. In that film, I think my life is just in the village. But right now, my life is better, not just in the village, but in the city, in the university, in the world. Yeah, it's big.
For our nonprofits, it's important for organizations to tell the story, but how do you think that organizations can do that in a way that is good for everyone?
If you want to put it in online, I think it's a good way to ask them what do you want, and if they say yes, ask them why. But if they say no, ask them why. That you can understand and we can learn together.
When you turned 18, I asked you if we could put your film online. You said no. And I'm so proud of you for being honest. So can you tell me why you chose to not have it online?
Because, yeah, the first thing I think I am a child. I am not grow up enough. I don't want them to think like every life will be like that. It's bad. I think the film is about my family, my life, and my mom. I don't want them to be sad with me in that film. I am grown up. I am not be like that. And I don't want them to remember me in that way all the time because the world is changed and I am changed too.
So I think we can open it up now to some Q&A. Maggie, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, so if anybody has any questions for Rachel, you can either type them in the chat and I can read them, or you can even direct message her yourself. But we just wanted to kind of open it up for you guys to ask her anything that you might want to ask.
Awesome. I'm so sorry. I'm just seeing that people couldn't hear the audio and the video. Was that true for everyone?
I think you had yourself muted for a little bit, but then I unmuted it so then they could hear it. It was only a brief couple of seconds.
Okay.
Hi, girls. I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Okay, so I'm getting ready to pick up my daughter, so I was like, I might as well jump in real quick. So this is my first time attending Ensure, and I got invited by Dr. Morgan. And I guess my question would be, with the storytelling, like, I feel like this is really profound. You know, I'm new to the whole human trafficking and getting aware. Obviously, I'm a parent. Is there resources that you guys have as far as storytelling that's appropriate for younger ages to kind of make them aware? Or do you get what I'm like? Some of the stories may not be appropriate for a 10-year-old or a 13-year-old, but are there certain resources that, because, you know, as prevention, I think that's, as a mom, where I'm coming from. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I'm sure there are resources available. I've heard of different organizations producing literature in the forms of, you know, comic books, things like that. And if you want to send me an email, I'd be happy to compile a list of some things that come to mind, if that's helpful. And I can put my email in the chat as well.
We have a couple questions. What was the name of the book that you recommended at the beginning of the session?
Yeah, I think I quoted a couple of different books actually throughout. So one of them is The Storytelling Animal. And I can copy and paste that and put it into the chat for you. There's also a book on scarcity. That might be what you're referencing. And I can also put that in the chat for you as well. That poor author, I butcher his name every time I say it. But I'll put that in here as well.
Okay, perfect. We had another question. What common mistakes have you seen with people telling survivor stories, and how can we avoid and fix those common issues?
That's a really great question. And I think the first I would do is point the question towards a group called Survivor Alliance. A colleague of mine, Mindang, has put together some excellent resources on interviewing survivors. She is a survivor herself. And so I would 100% reference you towards that. And if you're unfamiliar with Min, her name is M-I-N-H. Her last name is Dang, D-A-N-G. And she runs a group called Survivor Alliance. And on there is a tip sheet or a white page, if you may, on how to kind of best ethically conduct interviews with survivors. And so I would 100% recommend you to that. That being said, one of the motivating factors for me is I've been working in anti-trafficking for, gosh, I think 13 years now. And when we began to see stories coming out, and again, my focus is all in prevention. And so I think it's important to remind people of that. But being in the movement for so long and working in the sector for so long, watching the marketing that was coming out from different colleagues of mine in this space, I began to worry that the stories that were being shared so publicly were either harmful, at best embarrassing, and at worst re-traumatizing. And I just kept thinking to myself, we can do better than this. And so really wanting to flip those power dynamics. And so I think when we tell or share a story, which all nonprofits share stories, it's how we communicate with our donors, it's how we provide transparency. but to really reflect on what is the purpose of that story. Is it to engage a donor, or are we now sharing story to further educate and bring to light the realities of the issues that we work in, the resilience of the people that we work with? And so this is an excellent question. And I think that there's a lot to that. If you want to unpack it more, we do have some great resources on our website, as well as a podcast. And there's a couple of our podcast episodes that feature survivors, and you could listen to those as well.
Awesome. There was another question that says, is there a resource or a framework for learning more about what consent actually looks like, maybe from a survivor? And like, is there just a framework that people could use for that?
That's a great question. I don't know if a framework has actually been written down, but there are places to gather some best practices. One of those is, again, going back to Min and the interview process and kind of reading through that sheet that she put out in there. She also talks about the consent process. Another resource is through Michael Cass. Michael Cass released probably a 4-page summary of ethical storytelling, and this was in the context of working with the unhoused population. But regardless, in there's also the process of consent, and some of the power dynamics that are present within storytelling that also show up in the consent process. But that's a good question, and it's something I'll think more about in terms of perhaps working with some of my colleagues to actually put something formal together on what deep consent is versus just consent.
I'm reading one of the questions.
Yeah, from Kathy. This is a great question.
Yeah, you can go ahead and address it if you'd like. If you want me to read it out loud, I can.
Yeah, go ahead and read it out loud for those that don't have the chat in front of them.
Okay, perfect. So Kathy says, there is such emphasis by many well-intentioned organizations, I'm sorry, I can't speak today, to ask people who have been trafficked to present their story in public because they perceive it has more impact for fundraising. How can we flip that to be sure that we don't re-traumatize the survivor by asking them to tell their story?
It's a great question, and it's not a simple answer. So I think I'll touch on a few points. And unfortunately, it was always an almost impossible question to fully encompass, but yeah, great question. So a couple of things to think about is where is the person in their story? And again, we work in prevention at the Freedom Story, but one of the questions that we always ask ourselves and then our team, as we're reflecting on which stories we might want to highlight, is who is at a place of stability in their narrative. And so really making sure that we're not seeking out the most sensational stories, which I think can be tempting to do as a nonprofit, but instead to be looking for young people. We work with mostly children. So looking for stories where that young person is in a place of stability and is in a place where they have a lot of support around them, and is in a place where if they decide to share their story, that it won't offer or perpetuate any harm to their lives or to their community. And I think that, then you can kind of take those thoughts and apply them to asking survivors if they are at a place of maybe wanting to share their story. And I think one thing to differentiate that's really important is the difference between telling versus sharing. And a lot of times, people that are in positions of power will assume that because someone decided to tell their story means that they are ready to share their story. And by telling their story, that usually is what happens in a place of confidence. I might call a friend and tell them something personal going on in my life, but that doesn't mean that I'm ready to share that with the general public. And so having the wisdom to differentiate between is really important as well.
Awesome. Someone also asked if you have a booth at the exhibition tonight.
I do.
Later.
Yeah. In it right now, I think it has mostly Freedom Story content, but I will make sure to add the ethical storytelling links as well.
Perfect. Okay, I think that's all the questions that we've had for the chat. Oh, one more. Can you explain telling versus sharing a little bit deeper?
Yeah, be happy to. So I think the telling, right, is what happens in a safe and trusted relationship or space. And sharing is bringing that to a more broader public audience. And, so even in Kat and I's relationship, I've known Kat since she was 9. She's now 22 years old and graduating from college this year. She's come and lived with me in the States multiple summers to study English. So she's become a good friend. And we have many conversations where she tells things while we're, sitting on the couch, just the two of us. But as a nonprofit leader, it doesn't mean that I then have the ability or the right to go and share that with the general public, or even at that point to ask Kat to share it more widely than the safe space of my living room. And so differentiating between what the telling versus the sharing in layman's terms would simply be that telling is oftentimes what happens between a trusted friends or in a safe space. Sharing is bringing that more to the general public.
Awesome. So I think that's all the questions so far, but if you want to wait a couple minutes just to make sure there's not any more that come through.
Sure. And if there are more questions, great. If not, I will say just to leave people with some resources if you want to dig a little bit deeper. We do have a website. It's ethicalstorytelling.com. Ethical storytelling is run entirely by volunteers. So it began as a passion project for some of us in the NGO space and has continued as a passion project. And so we have different resources that we offer from webinars, which you are free to download and share as training modules if you're part of an organization, or just as self-education if that's something that you're interested in. We also have a podcast, and so we are available on I think every podcast platform that there is, but if you find one that we're not on, please let me know. But you can subscribe. It's just Ethical Storytelling. It's a yellow logo. And our most recent series that came out in 2020 was around power dynamics, and it was a very powerful series. And so I highly recommend listening to that. And then we also have a pledge, and our pledge is simply a pledge. And I would ask that you consider reading it, signing it. You can print it out, put it at your desk, keep it on your fridge, whatever you want. But it's a great reference to go back to as you might be asking yourself some questions in the role or the work that you're in about ethical storytelling. It's a good point of reference.
Okay, awesome. Is there anything else you'd like to share, or is that it?
I think that's good.
Okay,
Thank
perfect.
you so much
Thank
for
you.
those that joined.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.